Welcome to Inside Crime the Experts, episode 13. In this series, we'll bring you updates on what is making news in the world of crime. Our experts will take you inside some of the most challenging crimes and mysteries. Many of these are unsolved. They're the stories of serial killers, murders, organised crime, disappearances, scams, frauds and heists. And now to our experts. Tim Watson-Munro is Australia's leading criminal psychologist. He's delved into the minds and crimes of some of the most notorious criminals in Australia and from around the globe. Dr. Xanthi Mallet is a world-renowned criminologist and Associate Professor of Criminology at the Central Queensland University. And I'm Duncan McNabb. I started my life of crime as a detective in policing, then I moved into major criminal defence and the corporate sector before heading to the media as an investigative journalist, author and TV producer. In this series, we'll bring you updates on what is making the news in crime from around the world. Now, as I said earlier, this is episode 13 and our first for 2026. 2026 is a year of major anniversaries of some crimes that are etched in our memories, crimes that change the way we think. 60 years ago, in 1966, mass murderer Richard Speck committed his terrible crimes against 8 young women in their dormitory for student nurses in Chicago. Speck died in prison. On Australia Day, 26 January 1966, Jane, Anna and Grant Beaumont disappeared from Adelaide's Glenelg Beach. They've never been found, nor has anyone been arrested for this terrible crime. The prime suspect, well-to-do local businessman Harry Phipps, died well before he became a suspect. Nurse Anita Cobby was murdered in Sydney on the 2nd of February 1986, 40 years ago. Her killers were sentenced to life behind bars and never to be released. Just 4 days later, Sallie-Anne Huckstepp was found dead in Sydney Centennial Park. This brave woman took on evil detective Roger Rogerson, exposing corruption in the New South Wales Police Force and targeting Rogerson. No one has been convicted of her murder, and predictably, Rogerson took his secrets to the grave. Finally, in Port Arthur in Tasmania, 35 people were murdered by Martin Bryant, who will rot in prison until he dies. And now to something quirky, a break from all this. Back in episode 9, we talked about the grisly trade in body parts in northeastern USA. Well, they weren't the only ones lurking in graveyards in that part of the world. In Philadelphia, police have arrested a chap called Richard Gerlach, and I'll be judgmental. He reminded me of Riff Raff from Rocky Horror. Mr. Gerlach was found loitering in a graveyard deep into the night. In his car, they found skulls and bones. Police searched his lair, a basement, unsurprisingly, and found 100 human skulls along with hands, feet, torsos and bones. Lots of bones. They also found jewellery taken from the bodies and a pacemaker. Perhaps a souvenir, perhaps something to sell into the second-hand market for countries who permit reusing them, or maybe just poor housekeeping. Mr. Gerlach had been busy robbing graves since November 2025, but hasn't been forthcoming on the motivations for his alleged hobby. Police are understandably baffled. So, Xanthi and Tim, let's have a chat about these very strange news items. Why do we remember these things? Why are they etched into our memory? I'm thinking about the Beaumonts particularly.
Oh, why the Beaumonts etched into our memory? Well, I mean, obviously we're talking 1966. It's a really long time ago now, but I think it just changed the way people viewed safety, viewed childhood. You know, people started locking their doors. Nothing like that had happened in Australia before. 3 children vanishing without a trace. And obviously, all these years on, you know, we still don't know what happened. And I think it's still part of the language down in Adelaide, isn't it? You know, when I was down there talking about doing a Beaumont, just vanishing and never being seen again.
We've had a couple of excavations to try and find them at various locations. What's the...
I was going to say, if I could just add to what Xanth was saying, I think any crime that involves children, any crime that involves children disappearing, whenever we hear about kids going missing, our hearts collectively seem to skip a beat because we relate to it, and it's the vulnerability of childhood and so on. But in this case, the Beaumont case, you had 3 children going out for a beach trip, a trusting community, and never seen again. And inevitably, that's going to have a massive psychological impact upon the Australian community, the Adelaide community in particular. So it's unsolved crime. It's the innocence of children missing, and people never get over it. I mean, you look at the Wanda Beach murders, same thing. People
William
don't.
Tyrrell.
William Tyrrell, and it goes on and on and on. So, but I think, just amplifying what Xanth was saying, the impact on the community in terms of our loss of innocence.
A question everyone has, we've excavated a couple of times, you and I have both been involved in it. What are the chances of actually ever finding them again?
Oh God, that's the $64,000 question, isn't
Yeah,
it? I
sorry
mean,
about that.
yeah, no, throw the curveballs. There has to be serious intelligence because the police are not going to do it otherwise. So unless they are discovered by accident, randomly, I think we're really up against it at this point, to be honest.
And I suppose it's just one from me too. It's a case that always, the other case I mentioned, Sallie-Anne Huckstepp, an extraordinary human being. She was a heroin user. She was a sex worker. She was also incredibly brave, bright, and articulate. And I've always thought that she was one of the catalysts in waking us up to how bent New South Wales really was back in the 1980s. We seem to avoid the catalyst, and we just go back to things like the Wood Royal Commission in 1992. But Sallie-Anne, with her media performances, advocating about corruption in New South Wales, putting the finger very much on Roger Rogerson and blokes like Nettie Smith, she never seems to get the credit. Seems to be a reticence to talk about how
Yeah,
significant she really was.
I think there's a bit of misogyny attached to that, isn't it? And her
Yeah.
employment and her connections with the underworld. And people are less sympathetic when people have that kind of background, unfairly so, in my view.
And it's yet another one of the unsolved cases that we have I think about it, in my case, I'd suggest 99.9% idea of who did it. Rogerson and Eddie Smith, deeply involved, both took their secrets to the grave, like in Adelaide with Harry Phipps, for example, as well. We have this notion that on their deathbed, people will suddenly become honest and truthful.
Not the psychopaths.
No.
No,
They
no
seem,
deathbed confessions, no.
they seem to get it. It's part of their shtick, their pleasure in life is to make sure that they have this secret knowledge and they keep it no matter
Yeah.
what.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw that with Ivan Milat and various others. They're not going to share their stories. They want to take that to the grave, and they want that last moment of infamy where everyone is kind of trying to access them, trying to get answers for those long questions that families have had. And yeah, I think they get that last moment of power from
All about
not
control,
talking.
isn't it?
Yeah.
About control, right to the very moment of the grave and beyond, obviously.
A
And
bastard
it
in
just
life, a bastard.
amplifies the point, I think, that psychopaths don't give a flying toss. They never did. The only people psychopaths care about is themselves.
True.
And that was very well demonstrated with Milat.
Yeah.
He had many
Self-gratification.
opportunities, but he maintained his innocence to the end in the face of incontrovertible evidence that he was the villain.
Bastard in life, a bastard in death. They don't
Yeah,
change.
for sure. Yeah.
And now to our feature story, Murder in Australia's Outback, a place where so many head for the trip of a lifetime and a trip that sometimes turns deadly. Over the summer break in South Australia, police have been searching for Tricia Graff, who disappeared in a remote part of the state. In the Northern Territory, the disappearance and murder of young Englishman Peter Falconio by Bradley Murdoch still gets global attention, a story that was the real Wolf Creek. Also in the Northern Territory, another very strange case, the disappearance of Paddy Moriarty at Larrimah. It's one of the weirdest cases I've ever encountered. And back in the news is the murders at Spear Creek, a bleak fly speck on the map just outside of Mount Isa in central Queensland. Unlike the other two cases I've mentioned, the victims, Karen Edwards, Tim Thompson and Gordon Twaddle, have been found. Each were executed with a shot to the head, which raises the question of whether there was one or more killers, or was it a serial killer roaming Australia's top end, or an opportunistic kill. These stories garner international interest whenever they occur. Many of them are unsolved. Why do you reckon the global fascination for our outback crimes?
I think it's because it's so typically kind of Australian. When you imagine Australia, a lot of people think of kind of the dust, the space, the kangaroos, the nothing. that is the center. And so I think that kind of grasps people's attention, just that nothingness and how people can vanish in that space, never to be heard of again.
But it's also remnant, isn't it, or reminiscent, I should say, of the Wild West in the USA.
Yeah, good point.
Cowboys, isolation, lawlessness,
Mm.
all these things. And on top of that, I mean, we don't have dinosaurs running around, but we have crocodiles, we have some of the most deadly snakes on the planet. And the stuff you read about Australia, really, it's quite amusing at one level, but on another level, you can understand why people are fearful. So when people disappear or they're killed in the outback, it kind of feeds into that narrative, doesn't it, in a major way?
Yeah, I suppose unkindly probably once opened, it was a bit like Australia's answer to Midsummer in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, don't go to Midsummer.
You don't go to
No,
Midsummer, and
no one should ever go to Midsummer or
I
any of the
suppose
outlying villages.
yes, chances of surviving the visit are very low. Must be the busiest homicide squad in the world working
You
in
would think
Midsummer.
so, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just in a couple of cases I mentioned in the introduction, Spear Creek, which is a case that is currently um, awaiting an inquest, the second inquest result in Queensland. This is a bizarre case and a terribly, terribly sad case. Back in 1978, I think it was, three people executed in this fly
Mm.
speck called Spear Creek. In part, the town of Mount Isa, I think,
Hmm.
which is adjacent to it, is becomes a character in the story. But bizarrely enough, the police originally looked at a traveling serial killer on the top end, which has got to be one of the nightmare stories kicking around. And they eventually, no one was arrested until, oh, gee, just on almost 40 years later, they arrested a bloke who had been a senior corrective services officer in New South Wales. But literally 3 days before the trial, 4 days before the trial was due to start in Queensland, all charges were dropped. So now there's an inquest in place, which heard some intriguing evidence last year. We're still waiting for a result. But the challenges of looking into a case like this now as a cold case investigator, or similarly, the case of Peter Falconio, the young Englishman who disappeared.
Mm.
Bradley John Murdoch was convicted of his murder, but we're still trying to find Peter. His body has
Recently
never been found.
deceased, Bradley John
Yeah,
Murdoch.
just before I forget it too, Murdoch was went to his grave saying that he was innocent, but he was a horrible creature. And around late last year, I also heard that not only was he a murderer, a drug dealer, and a rapist, with I think some young girls had complained what he'd done. He was also apparently loitering around outside a gay bar in Adelaide, picking up young men who the interest, shall we say, turned to horror when he raped them as well. The guy is just an appalling creature.
And then the late notorious Andrew Fraser, disgraced criminal lawyer,
Mm,
he did a TV series on it, relating to his firm belief that,
mm.
in fact, Falconio is innocent, and he retrialed the trial, even though that there had been an appeal, as I recall, that had found him guilty, so guilty twice. There was a lot of interesting theories about this bloke, but I think you're right, Duncan. He was just bad simpliciter.
Mm. And what's the complexity of actually looking back into these old crimes to try and find the bodies, try and find the culprits?
Mm.
Massive challenge on old mysteries, even with new technology around. What do you
Mm.
reckon the challenges are? I suppose preservation of the original evidence, of course, is one thing, but
Well, actually, I've been out to that scene in Mount Isa when I was talking to the police there, about a year ago about a different case, but we went out and looked at that scene. And like, I don't even know how you'd start a recovery out there now or looking for more or new evidence. It's desolate. It's, the weather, environment, it would be almost impossible. And the problem with the Falconio case is, where do you even start to look?
yeah, and I suppose the cases like this take us back to the very basics. We're going to have to rely on human memories.
But the problem with Falconio, yeah, people, there were some people who came forward and gave information to police, but we have no clue where his body is. It
See,
could
we
be
can,
over a huge distance. And so, yeah, I mean, whose memory would you rely on to even start to triage where to search, where to look for those clues that may finally lead to answers? it's an almost
Oh, it's
impossible
predators,
case.
right?
Mm.
Wild animals, degradation.
Oh, all of that. Yeah. So much space. It goes back to that, that wide-eyed, that nothing.
Just on that, you mentioned predators, human predators. Is there a sort of broad profile of the sort of people who you might find stalking people in the outback of Australia? Particularly, I go back to the original Spear Creek thing where they thought that there was a serial killer, back before we actually serial killers, the term was ever coined, operating from Dampier, where there was a guy called John Tesalaitis murdered in a couple of months before the Spear Creek killing. And there was a theory that there was a chap prowling the north of Australia in a Toyota Land Cruiser, very apt,
Mm.
murdering people, picking the vulnerable, murdering them, going through their wallets and just dumping their bodies.
Well, why not? I mean, we've spoken many times about marauding psychopaths, marauding serial killers having their patch. Zantz and I did the documentary Buried Secrets, where we looked at the travelling patterns of Malat. Surprise, surprise, wherever he worked on the roads, women would disappear. So it's not that implausible to suggest that perhaps there was a person who was using the outback for his killing fields. I mean, let's face it, the chances of being caught are pretty remote, aren't they? The chances of finding bodies is very remote, as we've discussed. And it just may well be the case that you're right. There could be a
Mm.
marauding, or could have been a marauding serial killer at that time.
And they are
And it,
literally predators, they're out looking for those vulnerable individuals who, especially back in the day, people didn't have mobiles, they didn't have the communications, methods that we do now. So people didn't know exactly where they were. They were hitchhiking, they were taking those kind of risks. And you have people out on the prowl because they enjoy killing. It's what they do as a hobby. So, and what is there to stop them when, there's very few police and they're highly likely to get away with it.
it's a good
I
point.
agree.
Why do you think they capture so much media attention? And with these cases that have gone global, why does it capture them? Is it that sort of the remote nature of the thing, of the complexity of the investigation, or just is it possibly the thought that there, by the grace of God, go, oh, I'm travelling through Central Australia on a holiday of a lifetime, and all of a sudden I encounter Bradley Murdoch, for example? That absolute horror.
Yeah, I think
Well,
it. Sorry, Tim.
no, I was just going to say, and it's Australia.
Where everything kills you, right?
Yeah,
That's what
where
I was
everything.
told when I was moving here.
Well, there you go.
This is
You're
somewhere
living
where
in
even the
Australia.
bloody plants kill you. Everything kills you.
Yeah, and I suppose just as a curiosity, I mentioned too in passing, there's this bizarre case that grabbed my attention when it first happened. It was the disappearance of a chap called Paddy Moriarty, who unsurprisingly was Irish. Paddy blew into a town in Northern Territory called Larrimah.
Yeah.
Larrimah has got about
That's a
12
US
people.
sounding name, isn't it?
It does. It does have that wonderful American like Laramie. Pretty wild West town. I think the pub was called the Pink Panther. 12 people in the town, the pie shop up the road, which got a bit of notoriety, a petting zoo for crocodiles in the backyard, or something along those lines. Paddy blows into town, no background whatsoever, becomes a fixture of the town, and then all of a sudden disappears along with his dog, Kelly the Kelpie. Dinner's on the table, no sign of Paddy. Never seen since. It's such an unusual place, to put it mildly. Paddy's body on Kelly the Kelpie's never been found. There's a couple of things that always struck me about this too, and it's an element of some of the outback crimes, or some fascination, is that if you look into Paddy Moriarty's background, he doesn't really seem to have one, which always intrigued me. He bragged about coming out at a certain time as an assisted migrant on a ship from the UK. No record of him arriving, no record of anyone called Paddy Moriarty arriving on those ships, I always struck me as being odd. I just
Could
always,
have been a nom de plume, couldn't it? It could have been a
yeah,
guy who's disappearing from somewhere else,
yeah,
and he's just taken on an assumed name.
Easy to
Well, he
start
couldn't do it.
again.
yeah. There are some a couple of journos did look into his background in Ireland, but no one has ever actually been able to nail his background. There are stories about being given up by an unmarried mother, blah blah blah. A couple of people they thought might have been relatives who haven't sort of followed up their interest, to put it politely. I was just always speculated it was one of those many people that were deposited out here in the 60s and 70s by the UK government who were protected witnesses. Just another little
Mm,
stir to a
mm.
very strange story, but Paddy
And
never.
so his past caught up with him when he disappeared. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons, I suppose, why someone would disappear literally into a puff of smoke. The coroner, I think they had an inquest, and the coroner decided that there was no one they could charge, but had some strong suspicions about other town members, which isn't exactly a groundbreaking finding when it's a town of 12. It's a strange place, but
It is. I remember reading about this one, thinking it's a very strange story, and so kind of typically weirdly Australian in that sense. Like, where else are you going to get a town of 12 people with crocodiles and, and all those interconnections between them and those
The pink
oddities that were
pussycat.
going on?
question, do you think modern tools like DNA forensics, genetic genealogy, and so things, do they make tracking these criminals in the outback a lot easier? Or is it,
In,
does
God,
the
in the
distance defeat
outback,
them?
in the outback, I mean, genealogy, yes. If you can find an offender's or a person of interest suspect's DNA, yeah, genealogy is going to help because it's going to narrow down. But, you know, God, like everything else, there isn't going to be any of the electronic monitoring. There aren't going to be CCTV cameras, dash cams, mobile phone towers, helping you out to narrow things down. So, science can take you part of the way, but in these really remote places, it's incredibly difficult.
And did that exist at all then? It didn't. So, you know, makes it very difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, so
Beyond the logistics and the terrain and all the rest of it, back then there was no CCTV, was there?
Mm.
so perhaps as a contemporary investigator, unless you get really, really lucky, you're still using tools that you've been using for 40, 50 odd years.
But
Nothing much has
those are the
changed.
best ones though. The talking to people, good interview techniques. Those are where you get some of your nuggets, right? Door to doors. But then out there, there aren't even any doors.
Yeah, and I suppose that
Mm.
goes to a point that both of you have got some expertise, particularly in what happens to persons' recollections. I mean,
Mm.
I know that I've got a fabulous memory, but I know that I'm also wrong in many things. I'm sure I was right. Then I look back and think, no, you got that completely ass about face.
There-
Mm.
There's some
What?
research that suggests there's no such thing as memory at all, really, that we just build upon impressions and all the rest of it, and we're easily swayed by other impressions. But I'm categorically correct when I say I have a great memory. And I can test it with people. They say, how did you remember that? That was 30 years ago. But I
Mm.
know they don't remember. So I guess that's the paradox,
Well,
isn't
so
it?
we've got to watch you because you're just going to make shit up and we're just going to have to believe you because I remember nothing. So
Is
now
that right?
you
Really?
can. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've got a terrible memory, terrible memory. Yeah.
Just building on that too, it's a question. I noticed when doing a case lots and lots of years ago that and I went into this completely open-eyed with no expertise whatsoever. I noticed that the number of times a person is interviewed had a direct impact on what they started saying and what they ended saying, and it's how they
Mm.
were interviewed as well. Um,
You
I
mean
Well,
it
the
almost
interview.
became rehearsed?
Yeah, well, we did. It was starting to get worrying. We did what we called a contamination chart, which is, I suppose, sort of
Mm.
also putting a name to it that probably might have been a bit inappropriate. But when you started talking to somebody and you see, oh, they've been interviewed 5 or 6 times and how their story developed,
Mm.
um,
But
it, it,
it's also the interviewer. I think it's Anthony's
Yeah.
intimate in shaping the narrative. And we see this all the time where interviews can be, you
Leading
know,
or.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely. Or just looking for evidence that corroborates the story,
And
having
feeding
confirmation bias.
information. Yeah.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
of
uh,
that.
dear old
Yeah.
confirmation bias.
And
Yeah.
that's why, vulnerable people,
Mm,
people who are young, people who suffer an intellectual disability or a psychological condition,
Or
need
anxiety. Yeah. Yeah.
need to have a minder.
yeah.
They need to have someone there that can say, well, hang on, that's not quite right.
Uh,
Uh, but yeah, so it happens all the time. It used to happen a lot in cases of child sex abuse, where the children would be interviewed by the police. And I saw examples of this. They would use, dolls,
mm,
saying, where were you pointed? But in some of the cases, they would say, well, were you touched here, for example? There was no kind of neutrality about it. And a young, vulnerable mind could be steered in that direction. we have to be very mindful of these biases.
It's a bit, I suppose it's a bit like my absolute favourite, which I loathe every time I see it, is when a copper or a lawyer, and this happens a lot in court, they will ask you a closed question. You
Mm,
saw this, didn't you?
yeah.
And the person just says yes, or some cases no, but it's not a fair question, or answer this question yes or no when the question itself requires a good degree of explanation in the answer. And if you're in a position of power, as the interviewer usually is, um, people are just going to be quite often compliant. And it's where cases so often get derailed. But in these cases, the Spear Creek one is a perfect example. The evidence relies on people's observations 40 years ago,
Mm.
and that's where I think some of the questions about the calibre of the prosecution came in, and maybe one of the compelling reasons why it was dropped so abruptly. Um,
And we know that people don't even know. I mean, I know my memory is really bad, especially my memory for faces. So if I see somebody out of context, I may very well not recognize them. So a work colleague I could know really well. If I see them at the shops, I may not recognize them.
I'm
So
so
Wasn't part of
so
your doctorate on facial
it was
recognition?
facial recognition. It
One
was,
of the
yeah.
great
I
ironies.
know the science of it. I know, but I know I'm bad, right? Maybe because of my background. But a lot of people think they've got great memories, and
mm,
actually they're appalling. So they may recount facts and say things genuinely believing it because they don't know how awful their memory is.
it's a very good point, actually, and that it would be misleading at best for an investigator to then take that on face value. I suppose
Yeah,
this is part of the investigation where you then bring the other tools in. I've heard this. Now, can I confirm it? Going back to the basics of investigation: time, date, and place. Can I put that person in that place at that time to have the observation they reckon they've had? And that's where so many things go astray if you just assume they were right, because
Well,
yeah,
that's,
and they may be telling the truth,
yeah,
but the truth may
in
be
their mind.
totally wrong. Yeah,
And
totally
I think
inaccurate.
it also points to the need for independent corroborative evidence.
Mm.
You speak to significant others whose memories may also be flawed, but there has to be some point of
That you can
commonality.
corroborate, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why you can't rely on eyewitness testimony alone because it's so inherently unreliable, even if somebody thinks they're telling the truth.
which is, I suppose, where the art of the detective then comes in, to make sure that to look at the veracity of what that said using
Being
old-fashioned
a,
techniques we've just talked about, shoe leather, plus contemporary science if it's available.
Yep.
and confabulating bullshit.
Which, yeah, and that
It's
does,
a
I
Well,
think,
you
technical
said it
term.
happens. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Well, it's a
yeah,
mixture
yeah,
of terms. I mean,
yeah.
that happened too. Uh, no disrespect to your former profession, Duncan, but we all remember the Darlow drop and the verbal and all
Oh,
those
yeah.
sorts of things that went on where, the accused might be persuaded to make a confession or not make a confession, but the unsigned record
Record
of
of interview,
interview would
Oh,
be
yeah,
tendered
that
to
you got to
them.
love those.
which were very much of the period we were talking about, I suppose. Yeah, the Darlow
Absolutely.
drop, yes. Mm. Um, the threat of it being clouded about the head with the white pages, which I received my new white pages yesterday, and it's about sort of half an inch thick. So the prospect of it being threatening is fairly minimal these days. But yeah, the unsigned record interview, quite famous in the period, very much when Sallie-Anne Huckstepp was about as well.
Correct.
Roger Rogerson was a masterful of these things, and I do recall in my youth seeing it done. First murder case I ever did, Leslie James Gibson, never get him out of my head. A bloke utterly forgettable apart from the way he smelled. Um, I was chatting to him in one
Was a
room.
distinguishing bit of evidence, wasn't
Yeah, it's one of those weird bits of memory that you have, just chatting about. I couldn't remember his face to save my life. I could remember his name for some reason, but I could always remember the smell. And was that um, very much of the period Lifebuoy soap and Old Spice.
Oh,
it?
Old Spice,
Yeah,
yeah.
quite an interesting combination. Very popular in Australian
But could
pubs at a
be
certain period.
actually investigatively useful if
Ah,
somebody
absolutely.
else
Yeah,
remembered
yeah,
that smell. They may not remember him, but they might remember that smell.
Except
exactly.
a lot of people had Old
They
Spice.
did.
I still
Yep.
remember the look on Luke Gibson, as he's known, his face. We're sitting having a chat, and then about an hour or so later, one of the detectives walks in with his record of interview, and I thought, I was talking to him. How have you typed his question and answers? And it was just, I thought it is true. This is how they would create the play. Some coppers were very good playwrights. And then they take it to courts. And occasionally, Tim, you remember that period as well, I would imagine, that some judges took the view, or magistrates took the view that if the police were saying it was true, it was probably going to be true. I remember when I was a kid, a mate of mine's father was a magistrate, and he once said to me, and I still remember this horrific moment, he said, "I don't care if the police are loading somebody up so long as they're sure they've got the right bloke." Yeah, just to take us back to the case of Trish Graff that we talked about in the very opening, the woman who disappeared in Outback, South Australia. They found her car, apparently, deserted. They haven't found her. What are the challenges to try and find somebody who's now missing in the Outback in summer for about 2 months? It must be quite the challenge for police to work their way through in the hope of finding this poor woman. What sort of hopes have we got here?
Well, I mean, 2 months in the Outback's a long time in summer, right? I don't want to go into kind of the grisly details, but we know that it's likely she's deceased, right? So, no sign of life has been found. And 2 months on, they obviously will be looking for remains that have significantly changed. It's going to, there's so much space out there. Was she picked up by somebody else? I mean, there's so many questions. And at the moment, they don't really seem to be able to know where to look. So, yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. A bit like Gus Lamont disappeared too.
Yes.
Again, a few months later, everything's gone quiet. And yet, how can a little boy disappear from ostensibly a back garden and no trace of him is found? No clothes, that he didn't shed any clothes, as he walked and got hot, That's a really striking one for me too. What happened to Gus? Where is he?
It's a bit like Paddy at Larrimah. The chicken's on the table for dinner, and there's just nothing.
Nothing. No footsteps.
They just disappeared.
Yeah, no signs of an animal attack. Because he was a little boy, but a group of dingoes, is that possible? Yes, but you would expect footprints. You'd expect blood. Something, anything, and there's just nothing.
And that's maybe one of the great challenges of these outback crime scenes, is that when you get there, there is literally nothing left. Peter Falconio, I think, if my memory serves me, there was a little bit of forensic evidence.
Bit of blood.
But there's also been rainstorms that night as well.
A bit of blood they found, kind of at the back of where the car would have been. But, again, you couldn't go back and reinvestigate that now. Not a chance.
I've got in the back of my mind somewhere that shortly after it happened, the heavens opened up as they do in the Outback.
So. Yeah.
So any forensic evidence actually at the crime scene, tyre tracks, that sort of stuff, gone.
So would either of you drive the Birdsville track in season?
No.
Would you be sufficiently anxious about all this that it would put you off travelling there?
I have a view about Outback Australia, having only been there a couple of times, is that, without being too offensive, it's a place I like to fly over.
Yeah.
No desire whatsoever.
Ditto, Duncan. What about you, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to, but I would take precautions because I know how vulnerable you are out there. But I mean, if I was driving through, I'd just be concerned about breaking down, all those kind of normal things. And then who stops, right? This is not like breaking down in the UK where there's going to be usually lots of cars going past. You don't know who might stop. And that might be the only car for like 10 hours. So, yeah, I would be concerned about doing it safely.
I guess still the odds are low, aren't they?
But their odds are low, but then, who else thought that and then vanished, right?
Yeah, you don't want to be the one backing the 100 to 1.
I don't want to be the outlier.
That said, I'm slightly tempted to visit Larrimah now. It just sounds like a fascinating little town.
It probably is a fascinating little town, but instead of going there, Tim, I think just watch the doco.
Yeah. Apparently the pie shop is closed. There were some somewhat unsavoury suggestions about Paddy's fate, which involved the pie shop, but they were, of course, completely and utterly whimsical. But yes, I'm not too sure whether you're going to feed at Larrimah, but you never know. Road trip, Tim? Road trip?
You boys go ahead.
I think maybe not. I'll pass.
Maybe not.
Thanks, Xanthi and Tim, and thanks everyone for watching Inside Crime the Experts. Our episodes are also available as podcasts on your favourite platform. See you next time, and please like our channel and podcast and subscribe. My book, Recipe for Murder, on the Erin Patterson Beef Wellington case, is now available in book and audio form in Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom, and out in print form in the United States just in time for their summer break in July 2026.